It's my sincere pleasure today to talk with Sandra Griffin, who is a former executive director of the Canadian Child Care Federation, founder of the Canadian Child Care Federation, former chief of staff of then Minister Ken Dryden, and so much more on day 2 of the Manitoba Child Care Association's 40th anniversary or 40th annual conference. So Sandy, thank you for this time. Thank you for sitting down with us. Talk to me a little bit about your career, where you started, why early childhood, and some of the highs and perhaps even lows of the years you've been in this sector.
Well, I think my story actually is such a typical one from 40 plus years ago of people that came into the field at the time. I was a young mom, new baby. I was needing to go back to work and didn't like the idea of leaving Meg, and I saw an ad to work in a daycare center, and I hadn't known anything about daycare centers before then, and so I phoned them and thinking, well, that would be good, maybe I could put my daughter in a daycare center and work there, and they asked me if I had my qualifications, which was just a what? My what? So it was a whole new discovery for me, and instead of going back to work, I decided to go to college instead. And this is, the fascination of a young mom with a first baby, then picked up the books and read about early childhood development and everybody's baby, as it were, and recognizing just this extraordinary rich time in child development in those early years, and just literally became fascinated, both with the topic, the subject, the work, and just didn't look back. I joke that little baby is now 44 and mother of my grandchildren. But, I joke with my kids that in coming across early childhood education and then just finding it really the most interesting area I've ever studied in my life, that my own kids then grew up with me going to school and writing papers and going to meetings and dragging them here and there and everywhere. So they still didn't get that mom staying home and giving all the attention, but I think it was a richer life for them as well. And I just found myself with every level that I went and studying about early childhood education and children and child development. I really just came to the conclusion that if ever the world is going to be a better place, it's going to be through what we do with our children, and just stay dedicated to that. And it made a fascinating career, an absolutely fascinating career.
So at some point then you got really involved from not just a service delivery perspective, but clearly then up to the more organizational, the association, and quite frankly, the political level. How did that happen?
I became a single parent, actually, and had to look at my paycheck and 2 young daughters to raise. And although I think I was the highest paid director in childcare in the Okanagan Valley at the time, I still qualified for full subsidy for both of my children. And I had we called ourselves BC Preschool Teachers Association at the time. I'd gotten very involved with the provincial organization, and at a conference I met Dr. Alan Pence, who was embarking on a national daycare study and was with the School of Child and Youth Care, and I could see where what I was interested in and my work could really transition well into a degree in child and youth care, and Alan offered me a job as a research assistant, and I packed up the girls and the car, and off we drove to Victoria and made a life there. But again, I did then an undergraduate and a graduate degree while I was there, and it was just the more I studied in the area, the richer it became. I was having a look at the profession at the time, because why was it so difficult to professionalize in this field? Why did people push back against it? What kind of models did people even want to look at? Because caring for a living is very different from most other professions. And so I picked that up in my graduate work and started studying professions. And it was through that work that I really came to my own conclusion that honestly, caring for a living, early childhood education and care is a unique profession, and it needed to respond to a unique model. And in doing so, and by that point, I was working with people right across Canada. And what we all said, we looked around and we said, we've got small local organizations, but there's nothing for us as a nation of practitioners. Many of us were members of the NAEYC in the States and would look to the States for resources, but there was really not very much Canadian. And that was the drive, that was 5 people sitting around a table one day saying, we really need an organization for the practitioner in Canada, so that Monday morning when you show up for work, you feel like you have colleagues all across Canada that are working with you on the common issues, on the common concerns, on the exciting part of the work, on the challenging part of the work. And that was really the founding of the Canadian Child Care Federation, was to come up with a practitioner-based organization of people who work and care for young children.
Still resonates today. So 30 years ago, how hard was that sell to get people to buy into that vision? And we'll add that to how, from your perspective, here we are 30 years later, how relevant and how important is that work still today?
I think all the more relevant today as the need for early learning and child care continues to just grow exponentially. We know that 80% of families with school-age children or, young children are in the paid labor force in some way, shape, or form. It is a fabric of our nation. And the partnership that these families need to have with early childhood educators is, I think, just critical to the well-being of the nation. And I think that we still have a field where education resources are difficult to find. Laddering from certificates to diplomas to degrees are difficult. Wages are poor. Benefits are poor. And with something that is so critical to the health of a nation, it's children, then we all the more at this point in time need to draw together as a very strong voice and speak out on behalf of the children and families we serve and the practice that we use. The difficulty 30 years ago was, at that particular point in time, people felt that there was kind of an either or. You either had to be advocating for a particular position around early learning and child care, because of course it was just fighting for any kind of recognition because it had never been really recognized by government or funded. And so advocacy was a very strong need, and people came together under an advocacy banner. The unfortunate part of that was coming together under a practitioner banner to really focus on practice. For some people felt like it was competitive, but it never was. It really was. It's a huge field and a huge need, and on the practice side of it, there's always going to be a need for a practice organization that focuses on practice, what I do in my work Monday morning. And you then also need organizations that are out there fighting the political fights. And it's very much a partnership. It's not an either or. But I think too often, and particularly I think in resource poor sectors, too often people are fighting for tiny, tiny little bits of the pie. And I think it sets up an unfortunate false dichotomy and not healthy.
Yeah. So 30 years ago, and fast forward to today, did you envision or think that we would have been further ahead as a sector and as a profession? Or is this kind of, where you thought it might end up? Has it met with what you and Karen and others all sat down and planned or envisioned at that time in terms of where could this sector go?
one of the things that I've learned with age is, oh my gosh, change is either almost instantaneous and immediate, or it's very slow. And so one of the things in just reviewing material for the keynote address and looking back over 30 years, I was struck by, I looked at the throne speech in March committing dollars, and I looked at the throne speech, so 2017, I went back and looked at the throne speech when I was with Dryden. And Paul Martin came out with the throne speech on the importance of early learning and childcare and committed $5 billion over 5 years, which is just under $7 billion now. I think $6.5 billion in today's dollars. And we now have $7 billion committed over 10 years. That $5 billion never did all get spent, as you know. So in some ways you could look at that and think, are we going backwards on this? But I don't think so, because no political party would not have a position on early learning and childcare now. That wasn't the case 30 years ago. While a lot of the stats have remained the same, I think the pressure is building. It's become a norm issue almost, rather than a fringe issue. And I think at this particular point in time, what we're finding is people really moving towards, this has got to get solved. It can't go on like this. And so, while I wish it would have moved along much more quickly, yes. Do I wish that there in Manitoba wait lists of 15,000 children, not getting into service? Yeah, I really do wish we'd gotten a lot further. But do I think we made huge progress? Yes. I sat with the ethics committee last night over dinner. Again, that was something we as practitioners did. We pulled together, we developed a national code of ethics, we developed a national training program 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and I talked last night, they have over 700 trainers in Manitoba alone on this. And we have a code of ethics that we own, that people actually use and bring to life in their everyday practice. And I look around at other resources on tables and remember the proposals we wrote to get the money to develop those resources, or, and I just see huge progress from all of that. I see a really strong foundation that's been created, the work of the Canadian Child Care Federation, and then in partnership with really critical partners like MCCA in that whole time. And I think if we can do all that, think what we can do in a go forward if even more people start to step up to the plate and say, I want to be a part of that. I'm a practitioner. I work in this field. Or I'm a parent. I want the people working with my kids to be a part of that. And I think the stronger that voice gets, the better. And I think the timing for that is really good now. Like honestly, if I was new coming into this field and found the Canadian Child Care Federation, if I lived in Manitoba and joined the MCCA, I would, the difference of when I first went into the field, just knowing so little and not feeling much in the way of support, and to look around and see what we've built now, I just don't know why every college and institution across Canada doesn't just give memberships to all their students to these organizations so that they can actually see the importance of being a part of that work.
So sitting here today, what's your continued vision for children and for the families and for the sector as we go forward? And I agree with you. I think that this is an amazing time and we've really stepped forward. It's not perfect, but that's perhaps the point, is that nothing's ever perfect and you always have to keep pursuing that. But what's your vision for children and families and the sector as a whole?
Well, when we first sat in those millions of little hotel rooms across Canada in the early development work of the Federation, and we were looking for that one phrase that sort of just captured, what the work meant. And we came up with children, the heart of the matter. And that hasn't changed. If you look at a nation, a province, a community, and you look at the health and well-being of its children, at the end of the day, if we do right by our kids, the rest of the world is going to go right. If we have phenomenal early learning and childcare services and supports for children and families, if we have good health care, if we have good education systems, if we really do well by our children, I think a lot of the problems and issues that we're trying to solve later in life, we wouldn't have them. If I don't understand why people can. I'll never forget George Bush standing up on that destroyer, declaring war on Iraq, which essentially committed the U.S. to $3 trillion and no progress, in terms of making the world a better place. And I think, what if we had had some brave person like that stand up and say, I'm running this country $3 trillion in debt. And you know where I'm putting it? I'm putting it in education. And you imagine these dozen years later, if the U.S. would have invested $3 trillion in its education system, where it would be as a country now. That's what I think the potential is. That has not changed for me. That we need braver politicians who will step out not feeling like this is some soft issue or another way of the state having to, pay for things that families should be doing, but really step out and say, you know what, we are not doing well enough by our kids, and we're going to do that, and here's how we're going to do it.
Did you think in 2005, when you went to work with Ken Dryden, that the sector had achieved it, that this was the launching point?
Absolutely, and you just saw how all the stars aligned in that moment. And I think if if the Liberals would have won that next election and that agenda would have slid into place, that we would have been a lot further ahead. 12 years later, all the pieces were there, and right across. You'll recall we had negotiated very quickly agreements with all the provinces, and we're just working on the territories, but over an issue that usually people would say, well, that's your responsibility, no, that's yours. No, people were ready. The time was really good on that one, and we had a minister with a real vision, and again, a real commitment to children. He knows the quality of a nation rests on its children. And so I think that would have been a phenomenal step forward. The sector was working well together, organizations were working well together, people were really pulling in the same direction. So that was, I think, a huge loss for Canada in so many ways.
Well, it's been great, Sandy. Is there anything else you'd like to say or add before we close this up?
Well, I think the sector has a lot to be proud of in the last 30, 40 years. And I think that the time now, I'm repeating myself, I know, but I don't think I can say it too often, that we absolutely need people in this field and people using the service, the parents. We need them to understand that a strong voice and a push forward will get us what we need. But if we continue to work in small pockets, if we don't work together, if we don't share resources, then it's going to be another 30 years of pushing that ball uphill. And it doesn't have to, we don't need a whole other generation of kids not getting what they need. So I guess I would say to anybody listening to us talk, if you've got any influence at your college or university, get in those classrooms, get those students joining, get them active, coming out into the field. If you're already in the field, find where your local organization is and join it. And it's going to matter. You are going to help change the world by becoming part of the work to do that.
Thank you so much, Sandy.
My pleasure.